In this video you will learn about the theory of utilitarianism, studying the key philosophers Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Peter Singer. Is a moral world a world in which as many people as possible are happy? This is a key question in understanding utilitarianism, an ethical theory constructed by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who was born in 1748 and died in 1832. He lived at a time of social change in London, a time at which demands for human rights were being made, and a movement for greater democracy arose. His theory has three parts: the motivation of human beings, the principle of utility, from the Latin for useful, and the hedonic calculus, the system of measuring consequences. Bentham believed that human beings are motivated by pleasure and pain. He was a hedonist, from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. He believed all humans pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Pleasure is the sole good, and pain the sole evil. Bentham developed the utility principle, the idea that whether an action is right or wrong depends on whether it is useful in bringing about pleasure or happiness. In other words, an action is good if it brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. It is democratic. The pleasure is not for one person alone. To measure the effects of pleasure, Bentham produced the hedonic calculus. This considers 7 factors of pleasure: 1. Its intensity, 2. Its duration, 3. Its certainty, 4. Its remoteness, 5. The chance of it being followed by more pleasure, 6. Its purity, 7. Its extent in numbers of people affected. The balance of pleasure and pain is compared with the effects of other actions, and the one which brings about the greatest pleasure is right. Utilitarianism can either be act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. Bentham's is close to act utilitarianism because it weighs up each individual act possible in a given situation. It allows for people to break a law if the greatest amount of pleasure is brought about. It is flexible, taking into account different situations. What may be right in one situation may not bring about the greatest pleasure in another situation. However, it has the potential to justify virtually any act if it generates the most happiness. It may also be impractical in weighing up each situation and each possible action for every moral decision. British philosopher John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 and died in 1873. He believed the well-being of the individual is of the most importance, and that happiness followed from being free to pursue one's own ends. Rather than being concerned with the amount of pleasure, he was interested in the quality of that pleasure. He distinguished between higher and lower pleasure, so some kinds of pleasure are more desirable than others. Mill believed that the pleasures of the mind were higher than the pleasures of the body. This is influenced by Plato's philosophical thinking. Mill accepted that temptation often leads people to choose bodily pleasures over mental pleasures, which is what the quote on your screen is suggesting. By failing to nurture higher pleasures, they become inaccessible. For Mill, both the amount of pleasure and its quality are important. Balancing the mix of these is difficult but possible. Mill's form of utilitarianism is focused on the individual, but he does recognize times when self-sacrifice serves the greatest good. Mill's form of utilitarianism is a form of rule utilitarianism, which establishes the best overall rule by what leads to the best result. So in any particular situation, you should follow the rule, even if it doesn't lead to the most pleasure for you as an individual in that particular situation. It is possible that rule utilitarians could still allow practices like slavery, if as a rule it produced the greatest good. So long as the slaves were a minority of the population, there would be a benefit to the majority. Australian ethicist Peter Singer, born in 1946, has developed a theory called preference utilitarianism, which wants the best interests of those involved rather than what causes pleasure or pain. The satisfaction of the individual's interests or desires is what matters. This means a person must weigh up the preferences of all those affected by their action, as others' preferences are not worth less than their own. Then a person should choose, on balance, the action which brings about the best consequences for all. Bentham's theory links morality to the pursuit of happiness and encourages consideration of consequences of actions. It offers a balanced, democratic morality that promotes happiness, with no need for special knowledge to make decisions. The benefits are to attempt to alleviate the suffering of most people. However, we still can't predict consequences with 100% accuracy, and there are often unforeseen consequences, sometimes far into the future. Following utilitarianism means that the needs of minorities can be neglected for the benefit of the whole. It could therefore be used to justify some actions, like murder or slavery, for the greater good. Mill was more cautious about the threat of the majority to individuals, and his idea of high and low pleasures goes some way to helping this, but may still allow harm to be done. It is also difficult to measure pleasure and pain, despite Bentham's hedonic calculus. Some people believe some pain is good for us and allows us to grow. Physically, think about training for sports, or mentally, getting into a stressful muddle with difficult work, but eventually working it out. In Singer's preference utilitarianism, we might not be able to work out what everyone's preferences are. What about people like babies who don't have preferences? Singer does not consider babies to be persons. Do you think utilitarianism is compatible with religious faith?